September 25, 1939, was a day that signaled the impending end of the Polish resistance against the overwhelming forces of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The German forces, determined to bring the Siege of Warsaw to a definitive close, unleashed a massive and final bombardment on the beleaguered Polish capital. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union continued to solidify its grip over eastern Poland, further cementing the division of the country between the two totalitarian powers. This day highlighted the brutal tactics of the occupying forces, the desperation of the remaining Polish defenders, and the increasing urgency of the Allied powers to reassess their strategies in a rapidly escalating conflict. The final bombardment of Warsaw, a city in ruins. By September 25th, the Siege of Warsaw had reached a catastrophic climax. After weeks of relentless assault, German forces launched one of the most intense bombardments of the campaign, aiming to finally break the will of the city's defenders and force a surrender. The Luftwaffe conducted an all-out aerial assault, dropping incendiary bombs across Warsaw in an effort to create a firestorm that would devastate what remained of the city's infrastructure and morale. At the same time, German artillery targeted key defensive positions and civilian areas, causing widespread destruction and chaos. The scale of the bombardment on September 25th was unprecedented. Thousands of bombs fell on the city, reducing entire neighborhoods to ashes and leaving behind a trail of death and destruction. The massive fires triggered by the incendiary bombs spread rapidly, consuming homes, hospitals, and shelters. The Polish defenders, already exhausted and short on supplies, struggled to contain the fires and maintain any semblance of a coordinated defense. Inside Warsaw, the situation was desperate. The defenders, led by General Walerian Chuma and Mayor Stefan Starzyński, continued to resist, but the city's capacity to hold out was rapidly diminishing. Food and water supplies were nearly exhausted, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties. The constant bombardment had destroyed much of the city's infrastructure, leaving the population without basic services and facing the imminent threat of starvation and disease. Despite the dire circumstances, many of Warsaw's defenders and civilians remained defiant. Starzyński's radio broadcasts continued to urge resistance, though his tone had shifted to reflect the grim reality facing the city. He spoke of the courage and sacrifice of Warsaw's people, emphasizing that their struggle was not just for their city, but for the very soul of Poland. However, as the day progressed and the fires raged unchecked, it became increasingly clear that Warsaw could not endure much longer. Soviet occupation, strengthening control and expanding repression. While Warsaw faced its final assault, the Soviet Union continued to tighten its grip on eastern Poland. The Red Army, having occupied the region with little resistance, worked swiftly to establish Soviet authority and integrate the territories into the Soviet state. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, played a central role in this effort, conducting mass arrests and deportations to eliminate any potential opposition and to suppress nationalist sentiment. On September 25th, Soviet authorities intensified their campaign to consolidate control over eastern Poland. Local governments were dissolved, and Soviet-appointed officials took over administrative duties. The NKVD expanded its operations, targeting anyone suspected of harboring anti-Soviet views or connections to the former Polish state. Thousands of Polish military officers, civil servants, intellectuals, and landowners were rounded up and deported to labor camps in Siberia and other remote regions of the Soviet Union. These actions were part of a broader strategy to remove any elements that could challenge Soviet rule and to establish a new social order based on communist principles. The Soviet occupation was marked by a systematic campaign to reshape the region according to Soviet ideology. The collectivization of agriculture continued, with farms being seized and reorganized into collective farms under state control. Industries were nationalized, and efforts were made to re-educate the population through Soviet propaganda, which portrayed the Red Army as liberators who had come to save the local population from chaos and oppression. For the inhabitants of eastern Poland, the Soviet occupation brought not only the loss of their national identity but also a harsh new reality of repression and fear. German occupation, consolidation, and harsh measures. In western Poland, the German occupation forces continued to entrench their control over the territories they had conquered. With the Polish military effectively neutralized, the Wehrmacht focused on establishing a stable occupation regime, combining military presence with administrative restructuring and economic exploitation. On September 25th, German authorities implemented further measures aimed at consolidating their control over occupied Poland. Martial law remained in effect, and the Gestapo intensified its campaign of arrests and intimidation. The occupation authorities targeted not only those suspected of resistance but also the broader Polish intelligentsia, whom they saw as potential leaders of future nationalist movements. This strategy was designed to suppress any possibility of organized resistance and to instill a sense of fear and helplessness among the Polish population. The economic exploitation of the occupied territories also intensified. Forced labor was imposed on the Polish population, with thousands being sent to work in German factories, farms, and other industries essential to the Nazi war effort. The German authorities continued their policy of Germanization, which involved the displacement of Polish populations and the resettlement of ethnic Germans in their place. This policy aimed to create a loyal German population in the newly acquired territories and to erase Polish cultural and national identity. Allied response: strategic reassessment amidst escalating crisis. As the Siege of Warsaw reached its final phase and the full extent of the occupation became clear, the Allied powers, particularly the United Kingdom and France, faced mounting pressure to respond more decisively. The occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces underscored the failures of Allied policy and raised urgent questions about the future course of the war. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain's government was under increasing scrutiny for its handling of the crisis. Public opinion was growing more critical of the government's perceived failure to act decisively in defense of Poland, with many feeling that Britain had not fulfilled its obligations to its Polish ally. On September 25th, the British War Cabinet continued to debate potential responses, including the possibility of increasing military aid to other nations threatened by Axis aggression and expanding economic sanctions against both Germany and the Soviet Union. However, logistical challenges and concerns about military readiness continued to constrain the British response. The Royal Air Force (RAF) remained focused on defensive preparations, while the Royal Navy maintained its blockade of Germany in an effort to weaken the Nazi war machine through economic attrition. The British government also explored ways to support Polish forces that had escaped to France and other countries, recognizing the need to keep the Polish cause alive even as Poland itself fell under occupation. In France, the government of Prime Minister Édouard Daladier faced similar challenges. The French military, heavily focused on defending the Maginot Line and preparing for a potential German offensive in the west, was not in a position to intervene directly in Poland. The French public, like their British counterparts, was increasingly frustrated with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. The complete occupation of Poland forced France to reassess its strategic priorities and how best to support the Allied cause in an increasingly hostile environment. The failure of the Allies to provide more substantial support to Poland highlighted broader strategic dilemmas. Both the British and French governments were wary of provoking a broader conflict before they were fully prepared. But this cautious approach also meant that Poland had been left to face the German and Soviet onslaught largely alone. The events of September 25th underscored the limitations of the Allied military and diplomatic strategies and the need for a more coordinated and decisive approach to countering the Axis and Soviet threats. International reactions, diplomatic maneuvers, and global responses. The continued occupation of Poland by German and Soviet forces and the imminent fall of Warsaw prompted strong reactions from the international community. Many nations began to reassess their positions and strategies in response to the rapidly changing landscape of the war. In the United States, President Franklin D. Roosevelt maintained a stance of neutrality but was increasingly aware of the potential implications of the conflict for global stability. On September 25th, discussions within the U.S. government continued to focus on expanding support to the Allies, including economic and material aid through measures like the cash-and-carry policy. This policy, allowing belligerents to purchase arms from the U.S. provided they transported the goods themselves, gained further support as a means of aiding Britain and France while maintaining American neutrality. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's regime continued to advocate for a negotiated peace, positioning Italy as a potential mediator in the conflict. On September 25th, Mussolini reiterated his proposal for an international conference to resolve the war, seeking to bolster Italy's diplomatic standing while avoiding direct involvement in the conflict. However, this offer was largely dismissed by the Western Allies, who viewed it as an attempt to weaken their resolve and buy time for the Axis powers. Media coverage and global public opinion. On September 25th, media coverage around the world continued to focus on the dramatic events unfolding in Poland and the broader strategic implications of the war. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels provided updates on the military situation and the responses of the belligerent nations, shaping public perceptions and understanding of the conflict. In the United Kingdom, the BBC and major newspapers like The Times and The Daily Telegraph reported on the continued Siege of Warsaw and the firm establishment of Soviet control in eastern Poland with a sense of urgency and condemnation. Coverage emphasized the plight of the Polish people and the need for a more robust Allied response. Editorials called for increased support for other potential victims of Axis aggression and debated the merits of launching an offensive against Germany versus continuing a more cautious approach. In France, newspapers such as Le Figaro and Le Monde highlighted the humanitarian crisis in Warsaw and the broader implications of the Soviet and German occupations. The French press reflected the public's growing anxiety and frustration with the government's perceived lack of decisive action. Opinion pieces called for greater coordination with the British and a more aggressive stance to support Poland, while others warned of the risks of escalating the conflict without adequate preparation. In Germany, state-controlled media continued to portray the invasion of Poland as a necessary and justified action, emphasizing the successes of the Wehrmacht and the righteousness of Germany's actions. Propaganda outlets like Völkischer Beobachter and Der Angriff highlighted the military victories and portrayed the campaign as a defensive struggle against foreign aggression. The propaganda aimed to maintain public morale and support for the war effort, even as the realities of a prolonged conflict began to take shape. In the Soviet Union, state media maintained a narrative of neutrality and defense, presenting the invasion as a necessary step to protect ethnic minorities and restore order in Eastern Europe. Soviet newspapers and radio broadcasts portrayed the Red Army as liberators, bringing stability and protection to the peoples of the eastern regions of Poland. This narrative was designed to justify the Soviet actions both domestically and internationally, framing the intervention as a necessary step to prevent further chaos and bloodshed. Strategic implications and the road ahead. The events of September 25, 1939, underscored the rapidly changing dynamics of the conflict and the strategic dilemmas faced by all parties involved. For Poland, the day marked a further descent into occupation and repression, as the fall of Warsaw seemed imminent and the country was effectively divided between two totalitarian powers. The Allied powers faced a complex set of challenges as they grappled with how best to respond to the dual threats of Nazi Germany and Soviet expansionism. For the United Kingdom and France, the day highlighted the difficulties of coalition warfare and the challenges of transitioning from peace to war. Both nations were still adjusting to the realities of a conflict they had hoped to avoid and were faced with strategic uncertainties regarding how best to respond to the expanding scope of the war. The debates over offensive versus defensive strategies, and the extent to which they could and should support other nations threatened by Axis aggression, reflected broader tensions within the Allied leadership that would continue to shape the early phases of the war. Conclusion: a war deepening and global stakes rising. September 25, 1939, was a day of profound significance, as the final bombardment of Warsaw and the continued consolidation of Soviet control over eastern Poland highlighted the brutal realities of the Second World War. The events of this day underscored the challenges of coalition warfare, the limits of pre-war planning and preparation, and the unpredictable nature of a conflict that was beginning to engulf much of Europe and threaten global stability.